Okay, this will be the first of a few of these recorded lectures. This week I'll be off to Asha. Subsequent to this week, I'll be posting a lecture for you to look at the week before we meet, before that Thursday, and then we'll have an opportunity when we meet to practice our goal planning and procedure planning. We again have a very brief hour and 15 minutes during our meeting times, so hopefully this will help move us forward. If you remember last session, we were talking about long-term goal planning, and we spoke about LC, and then you planned with reference to some of the clients we followed in the Moses and Klein intervention planning book. So just to remind you that we, for LC, we had two long-term goals: to produce embedded and conjoined causal chain narratives with the subcomponent narrative story grammar components as listed, and will produce explanatory narratives with procedural and causal relations incorporated. And we established subordinate long-term goals. The rewritten set were as follows: to code complex temporal, causal, adversative content form interactions. You will produce and interpret figurative language forms. Use and respond to verbs, adverbs, conjunctions, which signal suppression and reordering of behavior with these types of terms. Again, that was my way of getting at an executive function level of processing with reference to the referent taxonomies that were guiding us there. Well, once we establish long-term goals, what we think about, well, okay, story grammar we have here. We have explanatory narratives. We have complex temporal, causal, and adversative content form interactions. In other words, the microstructure of the narratives. Well, what do we think of? The next thing we think of is, what are we going to do? How are we going to help the client learn or acquire this ability? These abilities, or if we're working with an adult who had language and lost it, how can we help that individual rehabilitate and reacquire skills and competencies that they had in the past? What are we going to do? That's procedural planning. So that's where I want to turn to today and talk to you about procedural planning. And procedural planning begins right after long-term goal planning begins, which is right after goal planning begins, and that's at the long-term phase. Because once you establish goals, long-term goals, your mind goes to, before you go to short-term and session goals, immediately, at least my mind goes to, well, how am I going to help that client acquire this information, this competence, this ability? What am I going to do? And of course, the what I'm going to do also goes directly to session planning. What am I going to do during sessions to help the client acquire this material? Well, let's turn to procedure planning, and I've got that right behind this, set up right behind that PowerPoint. And I should pull this over a little bit so you have a relatively clean screen. There's one, somebody works with me on how to design these things, and she doesn't like me to have other stuff on the screen, which are my other, in this case, my other files here. Well, in any event, I have one up. What can I do? If I stretch this out, then I'm going to hide some of the material, and that's another problem. Well, in any event, we're going to talk about procedural approach, okay? That's what we do at the long-term level. We start thinking about procedures. So let's move ahead here. What are the critical decisions that we make when we start thinking about procedure planning? Now, procedure refers to context, the context design. What kind of, and by context, EXT, context refers to everything surrounding the behavior that we're targeting, the context in which the client finds themselves. So that context will have tasks for the client to engage in, tasks, which includes materials and things to do. And in addition to that, there'll be a linguistic context, which will be the way we're going to be communicating with our client. So there'll be the non-linguistic aspect of the context, which will be the materials the client will be interacting with that will help the client acquire our behavioral targets, and the way we interact with the client. That'll be part of the context too. So what are the critical decisions? Well, one of the first decisions, or the primary decision, is this: what beliefs do I hold about how clients will acquire the long-term behavioral objective? And in terms of these beliefs, which ones are supported by clinical research and underlying theory? So what beliefs do I hold that are supported by clinical research and underlying theory about how the client will acquire the long-term behavioral objective? This will bring us, we'll take a look in a minute at the information that will guide us in procedure planning, but that information very much relates to beliefs about how the client will acquire the behavior we're targeting at the long term. And then the other question would be, what non-linguistic or critical decision is what non-linguistic maintaining factors will need to be addressed in the intervention? The behavioral objective that we established at the long-term level and that we'll establish at the short-term and session level, all of those behavioral objectives will be linguistic in nature or communicative in nature, because that's our scope of practice, communication and language. However, it's often the case that there are other factors that are other behavioral systems that are maintaining the speech and language problem, right? Cognitive, sensory motor, psychosocial, and medical are those systems and factors, medical being a factor, that could be influencing language, speech and language behavior, and that we'll have to address. Well, we have to consider that in the design of contexts to facilitate acquisition or rehabilitation, designing of contexts. And I'm using context design really synonymously with the term procedure, because that's what we're doing, creating situations for the client to do things in to acquire our objective. One more decision: how long will treatment take? And the long-term goal is like a prognosis, so that we're going to be actually intervening and having the client do things to get to the long-term goal. How long will treatment take? Let's move on. Whoops, I think I went the wrong way. Nope, that's the wrong one. So at the long-term the planning phase, Dr. Klein and myself talk about deriving a procedural approach. That's the first step in a procedure planning, deriving a procedural approach. And we keep in mind those decisions. It's a decision about what I believe about how the client can acquire the behavioral targets that we've established, what maintaining factors have to be addressed, and how long is it going to take? Well, what's our guiding information? Well, first, the first body of information that helps us in procedure planning are the goals. the primary and subordinate long-term goals, because we're going to come up with procedures that will help the client achieve those goals. So the procedures have to be designed with reference to the goals, obviously. Obviously. Okay, that one is relatively obvious. Well, the next source of information that will guide us is the clinical research. Is there any research out there that suggests an approach to achieving, for example, with LC, story grammar in a person with a language learning disabilities, with a 13-year-old? And what kinds of research do we turn to? Well, I'm going to spend a little bit of time with you on more time with you on these types of research, but I'm going to keep it relatively restricted here. But still, the types of research that are available to us are meta-analysis, experimental research, descriptive research, and clinical practice itself, and I'm presuming that coming into this course you've already had a course in research in speech-language pathology. So you're aware that a meta-analysis is a study that reviews all the other studies that have been done. I think we reviewed that ourselves a little bit. A meta-analysis, and Asher identifies that as the strongest information you could have in support of a approach to intervention. Meta-analysis. Experimental research. True experiments involve a control group and an experimental group, and involves subjects randomly assigned from one pool into the control and experimental group, where you have a treatment. The control group gets no treatment, whereas the experimental group gets the treatment, and the groups are compared, and the groups come from one pool, a single pool, and they're matched somehow equivalent to two groups, minus the treatment. Descriptive research is typically where there is not a control or an experimental group. There could be one group or even a single subject that has been given a treatment in which the progress has been described or lack thereof. Or a descriptive study can also be where a typically achieving group of individuals are compared with a group that has a disability of one sort or another, where the typical group is considered the control, and the group that receives the treatment is the group with the disability, where the variable ultimately studied always there is the influence of the disability on the outcome. And clinical practice, you yourself or the clinicians themselves, when they write goals, particularly short-term and session goals, they include criteria for achievement. And so when you're doing clinical treatment, you're in a sense doing a little research study, where you start out with an independent variable, which is the causal factor in the outcome, and that is your procedure. You devise some kind of a procedure to lead to an outcome. Your dependent variable is the target behavior, and then you have an observable, measurable outcome with a criteria that for achievement, such as produce the behavior 8 out of 10 trials, or X number of times per session. You have an outcome, a criterion, an observable, measurable behavior with a criterion for its achievement. So in a sense, you've done a little study. So you have these types of research to lean on to support to find evidence to support the procedure that you design. But, as I said, in addition to that, or very intrinsic to the research, in fact, is theory, or another term I'm using here is paradigm, theory or paradigm. And we're back to paradigm or theory. Remember, we visited the concept of paradigm and theory at the earlier this as the first few sessions of this term when we were talking about goal setting. And the paradigms there had to do with defining language. What constitutes language, if you remember? And we had the Bloom and Leahy point of view, the Chomskyan point of view that we reviewed, an operant point of view, I believe, I think we may have done, I think those were the main ones, actually, to be honest with you, for paradigms. Well, there are another set of theories or paradigms that talk not only about what language is, but talk about how it's acquired, how language is acquired. And most clinical research, I think it's fair to say all clinical research is about theory building ultimately, about explaining how one aspect or another aspect of language is acquired. And theories which underlie research provide you with premises and implications. They have intrinsic to them premises and implications. Premises are cause and effect statements about what leads, what process or what experience yields an outcome, a behavioral outcome. What accounts for acquisition of something? What experience, what process, what context accounts for an outcome? And the implications of such premises are their cause and effect statements and the cause and effect relations. And the implication is that if you create a procedure that addresses these factors that contribute to a specific speech and language outcome, you'll have some success. The paradigms that influence language learning, acquisition, and rehabilitation that we will be looking at over the next very shortly are constructivist, pragmatic, I call it relationship, I'm going to keep changing the title on that, but it's a relationship-based pragmatic, social cognitive, operant again, and motor theories. Constructivist, typically associated with the name Jean Piaget. It's a Piagetian paradigm, also called equilibration theory, equilibration. Pragmatic, social relationship-based pragmatic, typically associated with the name Greenspan, Stanley Greenspan. Social cognitive paradigm, which is associated with the name Vygotsky, also Jerome Bruner and others, and many others in fact. And it's very much associated with the process called scaffolding. Operant theory, really the law of effect. It's beyond a theory, it's an actual law, meaning it's incontrovertible, that it has an influence on learning and rehabilitation. Operant theory, related to Skinner and, as I said, Lovaas when I spoke about operant paradigm in the goal section of this course, the long-term goal conversations we had. Now, motor theory is is another, typically applies to articulation intervention. And in the field of speech and language, I would say that Schreiberg and others have focused on practice, essentially, producing an articulatory gesture as the most efficient way to address articulation issues. So we have constructivist, pragmatic, social cognitive, operant, and motor theory, which have embedded within them premises about what leads to what, and implications. You can draw implications from these premises in procedural design. We'll be examining those momentarily, in fact. Now, in my career, over the many years that I've been teaching, and boy, it's been many years, as is obvious. I'm not sure you can tell from my instructional behavior, but from my wrinkles and my lack of hair, you can tell it's been a long time, right? In any event, I am a constructivist at heart, and so when I used to teach language acquisition and language disorders, I pretty much spent most of the time coming from teaching about the constructivist position on cognition and language. But I have seen the light subsequent to my younger days, and I recognize how complex language really is, and how many components of language there are, how many different modules or components. Again, we have content, form, and use, and all the subcomponents that comprise content, form, and use: phonology, morphology, syntax, semantic relations, semantics, pragmatics, and all the subcomponents of pragmatics, language function, cohesion, etc. All of these things, many things, and not one point of view about how a language is acquired. Well, no one point of view explains everything. In fact, you can't even ask I don't think it's a fair question to ask anybody, how is language acquired? It's kind of a trick question, because you really have, if someone asked me that, I would have to come back and say, well, what aspect of language are you talking about? Semantics, syntax, phonology, voice, fluency, what exactly are we talking about here? And it could be that there are different processes that apply to different aspects of language, no? And it's too important a behavioral system, quite frankly, for just one process to account for its acquisition. Just say something's wrong. Well, then other things maybe could kick in to help an individual acquire the necessary competence to speak and comprehend. Another source of information that helps us plan procedures is our knowledge of the maintaining factors, those factors that, besides speech and language, that are contributing to the speech and language problem that we're addressing, and also contributing to competence that may allow the individual to compensate for the problem. Sources, first of all, the people sources for this information will be caregivers, that is, the client's family, whether they be parents or spouses or one or another type of significant other, and professionals, allied professionals, professionals other than speech-language pathologists who have an insight into the client's behaviors in other areas, and maybe even into experiences they've had that could facilitate communication. These are sources that we need to address, bring into the planning process and maybe even into the intervention process. And those maintaining factors are cognition, sensory motor system, psychosocial system, and medical issues. And we turn to the teacher, the educator, and the psychologist in the area of cognition. That's also an area that does overlap with our scope of practice, so we have some background in cognition ourselves. Sensory motor area, that's typically the domain of the occupational and physical therapists. Psychosocial area, caregivers again, the family, and possible social worker or psychologist who may be working with the family, and perhaps the educators too. And the medical area issues, we have the physicians and maybe the social worker, and of course the family that would give us information, right? So these are the areas that may have to be addressed in designing contexts, which include interaction, to address rehabilitation or acquisition of the target behaviors that we've established in the long-term goal and that we will be establishing in the short-term and session goal planning. Okay. Okay. So let's think about a little bit and ask ourselves, how do people learn or reacquire language? Let's think about the paradigms. Let's take a look into the paradigms that I mentioned, and just remind ourselves, I know this is by way of review from courses that you've dealt with this previously, I am well aware, but just to get, again, first of all, make sure we're all on the same page here as to the different types of points of view one could consider in procedural planning, recognizing that our beliefs about how our client is going to acquire our target behavior are going to really direct or drive the kinds of tasks and interactions we're going to establish for the client, our beliefs. And those beliefs we want to be based on actually clinical research and the intrinsic theoretic foundation of the work. So keeping that in mind, let's move ahead a little bit here. And let me click on here and see if I can do this. And remember, the 5 paradigms that we'll be looking at are Constructivism, Social Pragmatic, Social Cognitive, Information Processing, and Operant. Now, how do learning and theory rehabilitation paradigms guide intervention planning? Paradigms embody premises, as I've said, about processes that contribute to language learning and reacquisition, rehabilitation. Premises have practical implications for procedure planning. Premises. What's a premise? It's a belief supported by clinical research about causal relations that influence language acquisition or rehabilitation. What's an implication? It's the application of the premise to the design and implementation of an intervention procedure. So let's look at Constructivism, my favorite approach to intervention, my favorite approach to particularly the development of semantics. Each of these theories, these learning theories or rehabilitation theories, apply more to certain components of language than others. So one has to ask oneself, well, what part of language are we targeting? And then which of these different points of view best applies to it? Or which one, or which combination. And I think in speaking just a little, just previously, when I said earlier in my career, I just spent most of my time obsessing on constructivism, but since then I've seen the light and seen how all of these processes, all of these paradigms have something to tell us about learning and rehabilitation. They apply to some aspect of language because it's all too complex and all too important just for one. And we're not at a point in anyone, even if it ultimately boils down to one of these approaches explaining everything, we're not there yet in the year 2017. So we appreciate the potential value of each of these points of view and their related premises and the research that supports them or doesn't. And we as speech pathologists, carry around like a tool belt of processes that we intentionally want to address in intervention or intentionally want to not address for one reason or another. We want to operate as intentionally as possible, that is, with things, all of these points of view in mind. The more we have in mind, the better off we are, the better we are as clinicians. Well, in any event, constructivism, what's the premise? Well, here are some of the premises. There are interactive, a bunch of premises, actually. Constructivism, language expresses what individuals know about objects, attributes, states, procedures for solving problems, and causal relations. In other words, this is semantics here, is it not? And it's really relational semantics. Constructivism applies to ideation itself. Remember the point I made earlier on. If we take the position that language is the relationship-making property of the mind, its mind function, and that it operates on mental objects only, which I'll stand on, that's the position we're coming from here. That it's that when I speak, I'm using mental representations, multiple sets of them. It's a non-linear system here with multiple modules, so to speak. Lots of linguistic objects. Even the objects we talk about that again, to remind you, what's out in the real world isn't what we're really talking about. We're talking about our idea about what's out in the real world. And that idea is a mental representation. So constructivism addresses two things. How the objects in the world go from out there into our heads, or at least we create mental representations of whatever it is that are out there. One never knows. God only knows, really, what's out there. We have what we have in our mind about what's out there, and that's what we're talking about. So we use, that's content of mind and intentionality. And then we use these other linguistic objects, such as phonology, morphology, syntax, etc., right? Well, the question is, how do these things get represented? Well, in terms of ideation, constructivism has something to contribute. That was, in fact, Piaget's how mental representations about ideas about the world, how they're constructed. That was Piaget's major focus across his career. Not only that, but it's not just the specific things that exist in the world that we are interested in intervention planning and assessment in speech-language pathology. It's the relationships that the individual makes to generate sentences and ultimately stories. And isn't storytelling one of the objectives, at least in the LC case here? One of the questions we have is, how does this kid develop the ability to tell a causal explanatory story? or a causal chain narrative? Well, he has to make causal relations among events, right? And this may bear on that, right? Now, I've just threw out LC here as an example. Different clients, different targets. But constructivism is one of the learning theories that we will that guide us, actually, the premises associated with it. What are those premises? Well, first of all, the language does express ideas about the world and the relationships that are made mentally. And this knowledge is acquired, here we go, as individuals. One, everybody, attempt to achieve goals that they set for themselves, create strategies to overcome problems, reflect, meaning think about one way or another, on the consequences of their attempts, the outcomes of their attempts. And that means reflect on feedback received from objects that are manipulated and relationships made and other people. Especially constructivism focuses on the feedback from objects. So constructivism as applied to language acquisition, as applied to procedural design, has to do with creating situations in which the individual can set a goal for themselves, and that goal often involves the manipulation of concrete objects from which the individual can get feedback. By the way, notice, one of the premises involves creating strategies to overcome problems. So constructivism is the antithesis of problem-free learning. We don't believe in problem-free learning. We don't believe this thing that could possibly exist. We actually recognize that problems facilitate development. In fact, maybe you have a problem-free life, but not me. Problems pop up at all times. I just would like to associate now constructivism with various things that you may have heard about in your studies. First of all, Bloom's principles of relevance, elaboration, discrepancy, and intersubjectivity. Do you remember that from your language acquisition course? And the use of these principles in interventions facilitates language acquisition in children. The principle of relevance, do you remember that? That when we speak about something that the child is interested in and engaged with, the child's content of mind at the moment, a play object, something that's interesting that the child is interested in, there's a greater chance the child will acquire the language we're modeling than if we're not speaking about, if we're speaking about something the child's not into at the moment. Elaboration, that as cognition develops, language develops, because language is there to express what's on the child's mind or the adult's mind. So cognition helps drive language acquisition. Discrepancy, if the individual has to talk about something in the future or the past that's not present at the moment, that there is more of a need to use language than there is if the material is right there, necessarily. And intersubjectivity, that process, that means targets, that indicates that the child and the adult, we all express language to express intent, and we expect someone else, the other person, to acknowledge our intent. So when the individual expresses intent and the other individual acknowledges it, the co-locutor, the person the individual is interacting with, the language develops intersubjectivity. And I'm going to, you will see, I'm going to click on this right now just to remind you that I think I may have showed you, I never know what class I'm in. Here's my son when he was a little baby. And can I get this to show? Yeah,
You're missing. This is great. I'll show you.
Here he is. He was a year 12 months at this age. I know that because he's commando crawling here, right? Crawling on his belly. And he didn't learn to crawl and then walk until 14 and 15 months. Crawl at 14, walk at 15. His brother too. Now he's a very large child.
Here comes Jordan.
And I'll jump right ahead. Here he is. He's trying to get here and see what he's grasped, see what's happening here. Now, Constructivism is all about manipulation of physical objects, relationship making, feedback through the various senses, and I hope I mentioned in class that that proprioception, along with tactile senses, visual, hearing, etc., is extremely important for language acquisition. Proprioception, feeling our body, and getting feedback through our body. By the way, that repeated movement of an object, and you know that kids, when they pick up an object at that age of a year, or maybe between 6 months and a year, you can guarantee they'll bang it. Often they'll put it in their mouth. They'll apply schema, which are organized motor actions, to an object to know the object. And that's sensory motor behavior. That's not language yet. Constructivism says that as we all apply schema of one sort or another to understand our world, initially physical schema, later on mental schema, which are again the relationship making we do in our mind, and our focus on particular objects, attributes, objects, and relationships. We control the environment and learn. See, bang, bang, bang. Circular reaction, sensory motor behavior. That was an early word of Jordan's. What was that? Egg. And listen.
Egg. Can I have the egg?
Intersubjectivity, right?
Egg.
And notice, why is that an example of intersubjectivity? Because, first of all, he expressed, I don't think I mentioned a minute ago in the intersubjectivity comment I made, that intersubjectivity involves the social connection between the individual, the speaker, and the listener. See, he's not just naming the egg; he's showing it to me, and even his intonation is one of social connection there. And then I respond to his intent. I gave him feedback. Right? Intersubjectivity. Also, his goal, communicating about the egg to me, and the feedback I gave him from that. his goal to bang. And goals, by the way, that kids set at that age, they're very simple. Now, there's more complex goals that could be set. In fact, let me go back. I'm going to follow this up with two other. You're going to see two other excerpts right now. One is a in my opinion, an excellent example of illustration of constructivism with a 3.5-year-old child with Down syndrome, who was the subject of a study that I did a long time ago on problem solving in children with disability. And I was interested to see if kids with disabilities set goals for themselves, and could try to overcome problems that arose while they were trying to achieve goals. And what I did was brought a bag of toys in, and essentially just like one collects a language sample, I instructed everybody, though, I was not to give the child any direction. Let the child do whatever the child chooses to do. And let's just observe. And I did this over several days. And the following is a excerpt from that interaction. And when we meet, we'll discuss that video, but just reflect a little bit on it maybe. And the question I have for you is, what is the child's goal? Which is one of the premises of constructivism, that goal setting. Goal-directed action facilitates language acquisition. Goal. What problems does the child encounter as the child tries to achieve his goal? And what does the child do to overcome the problems? And is there any evidence that the child is using feedback, information he's getting as he's going along, to at least adjust himself and maybe even to learn during that session? Now, this is a minimally verbal child. Since the child has Down syndrome, he also has low tone and has apraxia, which accounts for, and dysarthria actually, which accounts for his minimal articulation that you'll see. But nevertheless, it's a very good, in my opinion, example of a constructive event. And that'll be followed by another video I'll show. You'll see, I'm going to put that in there too. And it is of my own son, not Jordan, but Cameron, and my interaction with him on the axle task, which is, I do research on Piagetian types of problem solving in children and even in college students. And the axle task is something I'm doing research on really right now. But it's in a Piaget task, if you are familiar with Piagetian assessment, the adult provides a suggestion of a problem, of a goal that the child or adult, that your person you're interacting with, could accept for themselves, or a problem for them to resolve, and then see how the individual goes about problem solving themselves to achieve the goal. Well, the goal you'll see in the axle task has to do with, you'll see it, trying to knock down a target using an axle that has on it first two wheels that are the same size, and then I try to trick the subject by changing the size of the wheel, one of the wheels, and see what happens. That type of a task is a higher level task and may have some implications for LC. So these various events illustrate constructivist principles, premises about how language is acquired, with the types of contexts that facilitate the development of semantic relations and mental representations of a world out there. getting it in the mind. Okay, here's a video of that also illustrates constructivist principles. The child you are watching has Down syndrome. He's 3.5 years old. He was part of a research project that I was involved with, one of my first real research project many years ago on spontaneous problem solving in children with Down syndrome. He's 3.5 years old, cognitively delayed, at the moderate level. Minimally verbal. This is him in his home. All adults were told allow the child to do anything he wanted. I brought in a bag of toys and he chose this one to play with. Watch what he does. I'm going to show an excerpt of this tape. At the end, you can read off on top the URL. You can get access to the full tape by putting typing the URL into your address bar. The idea was to see if children with developmental disabilities could create goals for themselves and solve problems for themselves without adult interference or instruction. And this was one of the several children that I looked at. This will be an excerpt from this.
One just before that one's going, and just point to pick up.
Again, some things to think about as you look at perhaps the fuller tape. Again, this is if you can see this on your screen, you'll see the URL. You can get access to the full tape, the full excerpt. Yeah, think about what aspects of constructive problem solving this child is demonstrating, and what discoveries this could lead to for him. What discoveries, and we'll discuss that more when I see you.
What you're going to do, I'm going to give you this. this up here, and your job is to make that, knock that down. In this direction, again, same thing to do. Same goal, and that is to take the axle, roll it down the incline, and knock down that particular little tower I put there. The green tower, okay? Anytime you're ready.
Oopsie.
Okay, now we're going to keep going here. You can take that, you can do anything you need to knock down the tower. Move it around in there. I'll get it. Here we go. Again, you can move that around any way you want. Any way you want. Yes. This or that. The only thing I need that distance to stay the same. Any of the material you want.
Oh yeah, this is not good.
You can put that any place you want. Yes, good. Okay. Get it on the timeline. It's cheating a little bit because it's bouncing down. Put it back. Will this work?
Yep.
You have to let it roll freely. You can't throw it. That'd be cheating. Again, you can adjust that. You can adjust this any place you need to do it to get this to fold down. This can go anywhere that can go. There you go, perfect. If I could, here, tell me what to do.
Just knock it down.
Yeah, where to put?
Right, let it get rid of
Okay.
switch right now.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Here. Now where should I put it?
It's the same place.
What if I make you do it this way? Here. Keep it exactly the way I gave it to you. Gonna work?
Can I do it like this?
Yes.
Yeah, no. Can I flip this
Why is
around?
that? Yeah, you can flip it any way you want.
Because the weight's different on each side.
Wait. There you go. So if I give it to you this way, where should I put this?
This one, put it here.
And if I give it to you this way, which way to go? Why is that?
The weight on this block
Yeah.
is more greater than
Okay.
this.
Very good. Time we're going to go like in this direction.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed those clips or those excerpts, and we'll talk about them, and they give you, I hope, an idea about kinds of contexts one could create clinically if we are operating with reference to constructivist premises. What are components of language influenced by constructivism? As I said, content of mind and semantic relations. syntax, which is what allows us to express these things, the lexicon, vocabulary, morphology, functions of language, the reasons we speak, primarily, what are treatment implications of constructivism? Target, first of all, in the area of goal setting, we set goals too. And along with the client, we each have our own sets of goals during intervention planning for us, and then in session we have our goals, the clients have their goals. Goal setting, in terms of our goals as clinicians in intervention planning, goal setting, you target, if constructivism is influencing you, you have in mind that you definitely want to be targeting, as we set a rule about at the long and short-term level, functional communication and linguistic relations. Relations related to lexicon, related to semantics, syntax, and narratives. I could have added phonology to that too. Linguistic relations. And, keep in mind that's what we've argued should be the focus of long and short-term goals, these linguistic relations. Treatment implications for procedure planning. Engage clients in goal-directed play with concrete objects, or goal-directed problem solving with concrete objects with adults or children. Promote problem solving, and well, there I said it, involving concrete objects. The thing about clicks means I have a memory that I can rely on to remember what I'm going to say next, what's going to pop up on the screen next, but I don't have such a thing, i.e. a memory, working memory. Well, in any event, if you can follow me here, the treatment implications of constructivism: engage clients in goal-directed play with concrete objects if you're working with kids. Promote problem solving involving concrete objects, kids or adults. Goal-directed activity, kids or adults. Encourage clients to communicate about intense objects manipulated, problem-solving procedures, and causal explanations for outcomes. You'll see that. You saw that, I hope, on my Cameron Axel excerpt that I posted just prior to this particular component of this lecture today. The clinician comments, how should the clinician interact with the client? Well, comment on the client's focus content of attention, intention, and content of mind and interest in real time. You're commenting on what's happening, and these online lectures are, at least in on the LIU side, are embedded within something called PlayPosit, but I'm not embedded in that right now, so I'll skip over that. Charlie, I will show you some Charlie tape, some Charlie excerpts when I see you. Okay, well, another learning paradigm or rehabilitation paradigm is the relationship-based pragmatic, related to Greenspan's work and a colleague of mine, Elaine Geller's work. Premises of relationship-based pragmatic. Language serves social and emotional functions. Don't forget that language expresses not just ideas about the world, but feelings about things. Back to intersubjectivity. This is more or less a social constructivist angle on language acquisition. Intersubjectivity, then, the desire of the speaker to make content of mind known to others, is the driving process in language acquisition and language use, according to Greenspan and Bloom, in fact, Lois Bloom. intersubjectivity. What components of language are influenced by these pragmatic processes? I keep these slides have never been corrected. It should say, I prefer they say relationship-based pragmatic, but I'm saying pragmatic, social pragmatic. I may be confusing it. All of these pragmatic processes are related to the Greenspan perspective, and on intersubjectivity being the primary process accounting for language acquisition. Well, that at least applies to language use, affect, the ability, the feeling associated with language, content-form interactions, the lexicon. There it is. There's my terminology. Relationship-based pragmatic. Implications for intervention, for goal setting, target language functions, target circles of communication. I'm sure, I hope you've all had some background on floor time, Greenspan's approach to working with kids, particularly individuals with autistic spectrum disorder, although this would apply to anybody we're treating. Target circles of communication, which is conversation that focuses on the client's intent, where a circle of communication begins when there's a comment or language directed to another or about an individual's intent. Then the other person extends the circle of communication by responding to the first comment, or whatever it would be, a request or a directive or whatever. And then the person who initiated the interaction would follow that up with a comment themselves, closing the circle. And by the way, relationship-based pragmatic perspective on acquisition would lead us to establish goals for caregivers as well as the child or adult who is the focus of the intervention, recognizing that the caregiver will have a greater influence on the client than you or me as clinicians would ever have. The mom, the dad, the spouse, whoever the caregiver may be, whoever the significant other may be, is going to have a way greater influence on communication. In fact, Stanley Greenspan, who I'm afraid passed a while ago, and his colleague Serena Wieder, did not work, particularly Greenspan, never worked with the child, him or herself, but worked with the caregiver in interaction with the client. And I have well, it comes up after this. I have a clip of tape to show you on that. Off the, in any event, implications for procedure planning is to really guide the relationship-based pragmatic position, directs us clinicians to establish conversational exchanges with our clients and with our clients' families, which allow free and trusting expression on their side. Elaine Geller, my colleague, talks about going from the inside out in intervention and in interaction with caregivers and clients, meaning touch base with that client's intent and emotional status and work from there. And I always operate, Moses speaking here, always operate from a relationship-based platform. That's how I think it's absolutely critical for language intervention to establish a relationship with our clients and their caregivers, and always be cognizant of our client's intent, even when we have to be directive in the interaction. Their intent is critical. And also another point, the concept of competence. Our clients, you and I, as clinicians, and our clients, we are driven to feel competent. to have a sense of self-worth and competence. And clients who come to us, our clients, they have a language problem. And you know how important linguistic competence, linguistic functioning is, languages, for ourselves to be perceived by others as being competent. And I think I mentioned in class, face. We like, face, which is the projection of competence to others. Well, we are busy doing that at all times. I want you to feel that I'm competent. I know that this class has attracted some critiques here. Issues have come up. Well, I'm happy that you expressed them, but I have to deal with my own competence as a instructor here. and I want to project that sense because that's the way it is. We have a literacy program at LIU that I oversee. Well, all the kids with reading issues, they know they have reading issues, and they do not want to have reading issues. They want to read well. I don't care who the kid is. And they know that their friends and their peers know they have having problems. So they do a lot to either mask the problem or to make sure that they overcome the problem, because they want to project competence to others. Thus, we want to, in intervention, support our clients' experience of competence by establishing conversational exchanges with our own clients and their families, which allow free and trusting expression of intent and of affective state, even when we're being directive in guiding our clients. And we need to be therefore in interaction responsive to the affective and intentional states of our clients and families. And Greenspan directs us to integrate caregivers and partners into the therapy sessions as co-clinicians. I don't care who I'm working with, I'll always bring in others, the family and all, as part of the intervention. It's a form of interprofessional treatment, where we can learn a lot from our clients' significant others. So I'm going to click on right now this video link. Let's see if it comes on. And this is a short excerpt from a Greenspan-led interaction between a mom and her son who has autistic spectrum. I think it'll come on.
One, two, three. Do it to yourself. Ready, Caitlin. 1, 2, 3. Oh.
Good job.
What do I get? Oh my.
Sorry for the echo here.
2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Wow. I caught it too. Don't touch you. Ouch.
Okay, that's good for that. I think I put this on twice. That's what's happening. You're hearing it twice. Look at that.
You said
Yeah, there you go. That's a little example of circles of communication, by the way, there. I should put that back on for a second. I know it's just, no, I mentioned that. This was supposed to have been edited from 0 to 0.
1, 2, 3.
So mom is beginning the circle of communication here. Let me pull that out. I'll leave it this way.
You gonna do it to yourself?
He extends the circle of communication this way by throwing the object back to mom.
Ready, Caitlin. 1, 2, 3.
And she closes the circle and continues it on by responding, by picking up, really going after the whatever, I can't tell what he's throwing there. It's like a towel or something like that. And then she continues the routine. And she throws it at mom, to mom. I gaze to mom there, it seems to me. And I went back to the beginning. Sorry about that.
You gonna do it to yourself? Oh, ready, Caitlin. 1, 2,
And she even comments on it.
3. Oh.
Good shot.
There she goes. So she's responding to his, giving him feedback, right? Responding, and in a sense closing the circle.
What did I get?
And this is a better interaction there. She's also, her timing is very cool there. I'm going to see if I can find one. There's one more clip I'd like to show you. I probably when I meet with you, I'll show you this clip of a great interaction between one of my students and a client, showing this use of circles of communication as a clinical procedure. I'll illustrate that next time. Okay, let's do one more of these, and then we'll finish up next time. And let's just look at the social cognitive paradigm. Premises of social cognitive position, which is related to the man Vygotsky and Jerome Bruner from my day. And it is the dominant, it seems to me, the dominant intervention, the dominant positions on intervention are typically social cognitive and operant. Well, in any event, language emerges from scaffolding, a caregiver or expert drawing attention to objects and relationships and modeling language and problem-solving procedures. Scaffolding is most effective within the individual's, and you've heard of this I'm sure, zone of proximal development, appropriate for the client's stage of development, or maybe but a little beyond, and within familiar routines. By the way, routines are great for development. You saw in the last clip on relationship-based pragmatic, mom playing this ball throwing routine or paper towel throwing routine, whatever she was throwing. On the clip I'll show you, there's a balloon. We operate within a balloon blowing routine. When we meet, I'll try to show that little clip to you. And social cognitive theory recognizes routines as important. Routines as important. So Jerome Bruner talked about how important routines are. We all love routines. And scaffolding, as I may have mentioned already, but let me say this again. By us experts, us adults, me the professor, drawing your attention, or my kid's attention as a parent, I am a parent, to objects and relationships and modeling language for kids to internalize, which is what teachers do. That's what I'm doing with you, giving you information to internalize. I'm saying, here's a problem-solving procedure to learn. Identify premises from these paradigms, and then think about what are the implications for procedure planning. Well, you internalize my information, store it somewhere, and retrieve it. For example, on Thursday, when you take the exam, right? Hopefully you're not learning this for exams, but rather creating a mental model to apply to intervention planning. Well, this using this information that you're acquiring from me or from the teacher or the child acquiring from their parent or their clinician or the parent learning approaches from the clinician will lead to our self-talk and will allow us, the child, the client, the parent, to talk themselves through problem-solving situations. Have an internalized language, right, coming from us. We call that executive functions, yes? Using language internally to self-regulate. We've discussed that, haven't we? Scaffolding very much relates to the development of executive functions. I would say Constructivism does too, but that would be, I did an article once called, I don't know if I posted it, called Mainstreaming, which used to be what is now inclusion classes where kids with disability are integrated with typically achieving individuals. Well, here's a clip of, I think this clip is me doing a book reading routine with Jordan, in which I think it illustrates, if that's what we're about to look at, this will illustrate, yeah, here it is.
Oh, look, who's that?
This is Jordan at 18 months. Or maybe a little more, he's a bit older than that, right? I think that's beyond it. It's 2 years, right? 2 years. He's walking. He just started to walk at 18 months. No, at 15 months. Sorry about that. At 15 months, he just began to walk. So he's 18 months to 2 years here, I would say. Now, can I get this large, full screen and not double that up? It's going to shrink again. Good. Now let me start it. Notice, by the way, this also reflects, this is both scaffolding and Bloom's, illustrates Bloom's relevance principle, that I'm commenting on this child's an object of interest, a routine of interest to Jordan at the time, book reading, and you'll see me modeling and expanding. What I'd like you to think about for when we meet is, what are all the aspects of language that I may be having an influence on in this interaction? All the aspects, in other words, all the components: content, form, use, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantic relations, lexicon, etc., etc. Of all these, what are all the possibilities? What might I be facilitating in this interaction? Let's watch.
Brush your teeth, Elmo.
Bubble.
Bubbles? Where's the bubbles?
Bubble.
What are these?
Go.
Stars. Stars. Oh.
Go.
Cookie.
Da.
Where's the star?
Da.
Oh, top. That's water. Oh, look, Jordan. What's that? A button. A button.
Notice I'm commenting, expanding what he said, clarifying what he said, reflecting back to him his what he's doing. I'm reflecting back to him. And at the same time, drawing his attention to new things, right? Or other things.
Hi, Elma. Elmo's reading a book with the stars. Oh, look.
Elmo book. He says, I say Elmo reading a book. I'm staying maybe one stage ahead of him within his zone of proximal development, right?
Boat, right? A nice boat. Ooh, go to sleep, Elmo. Where's the boat? Where's the boat? Where's that boat? Your boat here? No. Your boat here? Oh. No. Huh? There's the boat. Uh-huh. Boat. Where's the moose?
He's regulating the routine, right? Okay, that's as far as we'll go today. We'll continue on when I see you next time. Good luck on the exam, and that'll be it for today.